The scream came first. High above Tokyo, slicing through the darkness of March 10, 1945, Lieutenant Seichio Endo heard it. A sound like tearing silk. The hum of 2,700 horsepower engines multiplied by hundreds. Boeing B-29 Superfortresses. Flying low. Flying at night. Flying in a way that shattered every rule Endo had learned about American bombers. He pushed the throttles of his Nakajima J1N1 Gecko forward. The twin Seiki engines roared. In the navigator's seat behind him, his radar operator scanned the primitive Type 3 Mark 6 scope. Nothing. Just static and shadows. The Americans were 5,000 feet below, invisible in the darkness, detectable only by the thunder of their passage. This was not how night fighting was supposed to work. Endo had trained for patient interceptions. Guided by ground radar. Vectored into position. Approaching from below with his upward-firing 20mm cannons. But tonight, there was no guidance. No vectors. Just chaos. The sky over Tokyo was burning, and somewhere in that inferno flew 300 American bombers that his radar could not find. For over a year, Japan's night fighters had been the Empire's last defense against the darkness. Pilots like Endo were the hunters. Men who had learned to kill without seeing. Men who had mastered the oblique cannon, the searchlight, the patient stalk through black skies. They had shot down B-17s. They had destroyed B-24s. They had proven that Japanese ingenuity could match American technology. But on this night, as incendiary bombs transformed Tokyo into a lake of fire, Endo understood a terrible truth. The Americans had changed the rules. They no longer needed altitude. They no longer feared the darkness. And Japan's elite night fighters, for all their skill and courage, were hunting ghosts they could not catch. The question was simple and devastating. Why had the weapon that once protected the Empire become powerless against America's new tactics? Why could Japan's most skilled pilots no longer find their prey? The answer would be written in fire and radar waves, in burning cities and empty gun sites, in the desperate mathematics of technology versus courage. And it would reveal the most painful lesson of the Pacific War, that skill alone, no matter how refined, could not overcome the vast gulf in electronic warfare that separated Japan from its enemy. To understand how Japan's night fighters fell from dominance to desperation, we must return to the beginning. To the moment when darkness itself became a weapon. Rabaul. May 21, 1943. The moon hung low over Simpson Harbor, casting silver light across the waters where Japanese cruisers rested. On the coral strip that served as the airfield, Commander Yasuna Kozono stood beside a twin-engine aircraft that should never have been a fighter. The Nakajima J-1N reconnaissance plane was ungainly. Too large. Too slow. Rejected by the Imperial Navy as a long-range escort fighter because it could not maneuver with single-engine aircraft. Relegated to photo reconnaissance. A machine designed to watch, not to kill. But Kozono saw something else. He saw the long hours it could remain airborne. The stable gun platform its twin engines provided. The space in the fuselage where an observer once sat a day. Space that could hold something new. 4 months, American B-17 flying fortresses had been bombing Rabaul at night. Flying in darkness. Releasing their loads on Japanese positions with impunity. Japan's day fighters were useless after sunset. Searchlights swept empty skies. Anti-aircraft guns fired blind. The Americans owned the night. Kozono had ordered his maintenance crews to modify a single J-1N. They removed the observer's position. In its place, they mounted two 20mm Type 99 cannons, angled upward at 30 degrees. 2 more cannons were installed firing downward at the same angle. This arrangement, unknown to Kozono, was being developed simultaneously by German night fighters. The Luftwaffe called it Schrage music. Slanted music. The song of death from below. The Americans flying their B-17s had calculated their defenses based on horizontal attacks. Ball turrets protected the belly. Waist guns covered the flanks. Top turrets swept the sky above. But no one had anticipated an attack from directly beneath, from a fighter rising slowly into position, guns already aimed upward, firing before the bomber crew even knew death was below them. On the night of May 21st, Kozono's modified J-1N climbed into the darkness. The pilot, Ensign Shigetoshi Kudo, was 23 years old. He had flown reconnaissance missions for months. Now he was hunting. Ground radar vectored him toward the incoming formation. 6 B-17s, flying at 9,000 feet. Kudo throttled back. He approached from below. Slowly, patiently. The B-17 crews saw nothing, heard nothing. Their attention was forward, on the target. Kudo eased beneath the nearest bomber. So close he could see the rivets in its belly. His finger touched the trigger. 4 cannons erupted. 20mm shells tore upward into fuel tanks, into bomb bays, into crew compartments. The B-17 exploded. A second bloom of fire. Kudo had claimed 2 kills in one night with a weapon the Americans did not know existed. The report reached Tokyo within hours. The naval staff, skeptical at first, reviewed the evidence. Wreckage confirmed. 2 B-17s destroyed by a reconnaissance aircraft modified against orders. But results silenced criticism. By August 1943, Nakajima was ordered into full production of a dedicated night fighter variant. The J-1N-1S Gecko. Moonlight. The Gecko was born from necessity and improvisation. It carried a crew of 2. Pilot and radar operator. Twin Nakajima Seiki 21 engines. The same power plants that drove the legendary Zero fighter. Maximum speed, 315 miles per hour. Service ceiling, 30,580 feet. Range, 2,348 miles. Its armament was its innovation. 4 20mm cannons. 2 firing upward. 2 firing downward. Some variants added a third upward firing cannon. Later models included nose-mounted searchlights. The most advanced carried primitive radar, the Type 3 Mark 6, capable of detecting aircraft at 3 kilometers. 10,000 feet. Barely beyond visual range on a clear day. In darkness, it was a miracle. But it was enough. In the hands of skilled pilots, the Gecko became a terror. American bomber crews flying over Rabaul, over Bougainville, over the Solomon Islands began to report mysterious losses. Aircraft vanishing in darkness. No warning. No traces. Just sudden fire from below. Allied intelligence was baffled. The Japanese were not supposed to have effective night fighters. Reports indicated they lacked the radar technology, lacked the training. Yet bombers kept disappearing. It was not until captured Japanese prisoners were interrogated that the truth emerged. The aircraft they called Irving. The twin-engine reconnaissance plane. It had been transformed into something deadly. Something patient. Something that rose from beneath like a shark from dark waters. By late 1943, night fighter units were forming across the Japanese Empire. The best pilots were selected. Men with hundreds of hours. Men who could fly on instruments. Men who could kill in darkness. Among them was Lieutenant Seichio Endo. Born in Tokyo. Trained at Yokosuka. He had flown reconnaissance missions before transitioning to night fighters. He was methodical. Calm. Precise. The kind of pilot who could stalk a target for 30 minutes, waiting for the perfect shot. Endo learned the Gecko's secrets quickly. The oblique cannons required a different geometry of attack. You did not chase. You positioned. You rose from below, matching speed, staying in the bomber's blind spot. When the target filled your gun sight, perfectly silhouetted against the stars, you fired. 1 burst. 2 seconds. Enough to send 20 tons of aircraft spiraling into the sea. The doctrine was clear. Night fighters would protect the home islands. They would intercept lone raiders. They would make the darkness costly for the Americans. And for a time, it worked. In 1944, as American forces captured the Mariana Islands, the strategic calculus changed. The islands of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, once Japanese strongholds, became American bomber bases. 1,500 miles from Tokyo. Within range of the B-29 superfortress. The B-29 was unlike anything Japan had faced. Pressurized cabin. High altitude performance. Top speed, 406 miles per hour at 30,000 feet. Service ceiling, 40,600 feet. Defensive armament, 12 50-caliber machine guns in remote-controlled turrets. And speed. The superfortress cruised 50 miles per hour faster than the B-17 or B-24. For the Gecko, this created an impossible problem. The night fighter could barely reach 30,000 feet. Its maximum speed was 90 miles per hour slower than a cruising B-29. In theory, a Gecko could make one interception pass. One chance. If the pilot missed, the superfortress would simply pull away, untouchable. But theory and reality diverged. Some pilots made it work. Lieutenant Endo proved the Gecko could still kill. On April 15, 1945, he intercepted a B-29 over Kawasaki. One pass. 20mm shells ripped through the bomber's wing. It fell burning into the night. Endo's first superfortress. He would claim 7 more. Each kill a masterpiece of patience and precision. Each one a testament to what skill could achieve against overwhelming odds. But Endo's successes were rare. Most Gecko pilots never caught a B-29. The bombers were too fast, too high, too well defended. And then the Americans changed tactics again. January 1945. Major General Curtis LeMay took command of XXI Bomber Command in the Marianas. He studied the bombing reports. High-altitude precision attacks were failing. Weather obscured targets. Jet stream winds scattered bombs. Losses to flak and fighters were acceptable, but the damage inflicted was minimal. Japan's war industries, dispersed into urban areas, remained functional. LeMay made a decision that would reshape the air war. Strip the B-29s of most of their guns. Reduce crew from 11 to 9. Fly at night. Fly low. 5,000 to 9,000 feet. Carry maximum incendiary loads. Bomb individually, not in formation. Overwhelm Japanese defenses with numbers and speed. His staff was horrified. Flying low meant exposure to light flak. Flying at night meant navigating by radar alone. Removing guns meant defenseless bombers. But LeMay had studied Japanese night defenses. He knew their radar was primitive. He knew their night fighters were few. He believed the gamble would work. On the night of March 9, 1945, 334 B-29s launched from the Marianas. Their target, Tokyo. The mission was designated Operation Meeting House. History would remember it as the most destructive air raid ever conducted. Lieutenant Seiichiro Endo scrambled from Yokosuka Naval Air Station at midnight. His Gecko climbed toward the sound of engines. Ground control was in chaos. Radar stations reported hundreds of contacts. Far too many to vector fighters against. Radio discipline collapsed. Endo and dozens of other pilots simply flew toward the glow on the horizon. Tokyo was burning. Incendiary clusters had ignited 15.8 square miles of the city. Firestorms created winds of hurricane force. The heat was so intense that B-29 crews at 7,000 feet reported the stench of burning flesh in their oxygen masks. Endo searched the sky. His radar showed nothing useful. Too much interference from the fires below. Too many targets moving too fast. He spotted a B-29 silhouetted against the flames. He climbed. Pushed his engines to maximum power. The Gecko shuddered as it approached 300 miles per hour. The superfortress pulled ahead. Effortlessly. Endo fired a burst at maximum range. Tracers fell away harmlessly. The bomber disappeared into the smoke. He never saw it again. 12 B-29s were shot down that night. 42 damaged. None by Japanese fighters. Anti-aircraft guns claimed them all. The Gecko pilots, Japan's elite night defenders, had been rendered irrelevant by American tactics they could not counter. We need to pause here and reflect on what these numbers mean. If you find this exploration of technological warfare compelling, consider subscribing to stay with us as we uncover more untold stories from the Second World War. Your support helps us bring these forgotten battles to light. The aftermath of Operation Meeting House was catastrophic. Between 87,000 and 100,000 civilians dead. 1 million homeless. Tokyo's industrial capacity gutted. And the Americans had proven a point. Japan's night fighters could not stop low-altitude attacks. The empire was defenseless after dark. LeMay continued the firebombing campaign. Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, Yokohama. Every major Japanese city burned. B-29s flew by the hundreds. Night after night. The Gecko pilots flew every sortie. Desperate. Exhausted. Watching their cities die beneath them while American bombers cruised just beyond reach. Some pilots achieved extraordinary successes despite the odds. Warrant Officer Juzo Kuramoto and Lieutenant Shiro Kuratori, flying from Yokosuka, shot down 5 B-29s on the night of May 25 to 26, 1945. It was a feat of airmanship and luck. They had positioned themselves in the bomber stream, attacked from below, and found 5 targets whose crews never saw them coming. But such victories were anomalies. The mathematics of attrition were brutal. Japan produced fewer than 500 geckos during the war. America built over 3,900 B-29s. For every superfortress destroyed, 2 more took its place. For every gecko lost, there was no replacement. No trained pilot. No fuel. No hope. The core issue was technology. Or rather, the absence of it. The gecko's radar, the Type 3 Mark 6, could detect targets at 3 kilometers under ideal conditions. The American SCR-520 radar, carried by P-61 Black Widow night fighters, could detect targets at 16 miles. 25 kilometers. The gap was not merely numerical. It was conceptual. American radar operators could track, identify, and vector their pilots onto targets from distances where Japanese systems saw only noise. The SCR-720C, introduced in 1944, was even more advanced. It could distinguish individual aircraft in formation. It could guide a fighter to within gun range in total darkness. It could do what Japanese radar could not: turn night into day. Japanese engineers were not incompetent. They understood radar theory. They had developed functional systems. But Japan's radar program suffered from institutional failures that technology alone could not overcome. First, the split between the Army and Navy. Each service developed separate radar systems. They did not share research. They did not coordinate production. Resources were duplicated. Progress was fragmented. Second, the lack of critical components. Japan's industry could not mass-produce cavity magnetrons, the heart of centimetric radar. They relied on captured British and American equipment to reverse-engineer designs. By the time Japanese radar reached production, it was generations behind Allied technology. Third, Doctrine. Japanese military leadership, shaped by centuries of samurai tradition, believed in the primacy of spirit over material. Training and courage would overcome technological deficits. This philosophy had merit in 1942 when Japanese pilots flew superior aircraft against unprepared enemies. By 1945, it was a death sentence. The Gecko pilots embodied this contradiction. They were supremely skilled. Lieutenant Seichio Endo, in his final months, destroyed 8 B-29s and damaged 8 more. Shigetoshi Kudo claimed 9 victories. These men were artists of night combat. But they flew aircraft with radar that could not see and engines that could not catch their prey. American bomber crews, by contrast, were protected by an invisible shield. Ground-based radar detected incoming raids. Fighter direction officers vectored P-61 Black Widows onto intercepts. Bomber formations flew with radar-guided navigation. Even lone B-29s carried tail warning radar that alerted crews to fighters approaching from behind. The P-61 Black Widow, America's dedicated night fighter, represented everything the Gecko was not. Top speed, 430 miles per hour. Service ceiling, 41,000 feet. Crew of 3 with dedicated radar operator. 4 20mm cannons and 4 50 caliber machine guns. And most critically, the SCR-720 radar that could find targets in absolute darkness from 20 miles away. Black Widows entered combat in the Pacific in June 1944. Their first kill came on June 30th when a P-61 shot down a Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber near Saipan. By war's end, Black Widows had destroyed 64 Japanese aircraft in the Pacific theater. Not because American pilots were more skilled than their Japanese counterparts, but because American technology gave them an overwhelming advantage. A Gecko pilot had to find his target visually or with primitive radar. A Black Widow pilot simply followed his radar operator's instructions until the target appeared on his gunsight scope. The American fighter could attack from any angle. The Japanese fighter had to maneuver into position beneath the target. The American could engage at night, in clouds, in any weather. The Japanese needed at least some visibility to aim. This technological disparity extended beyond radar. American aircraft carried IFF transponders, identification friend or foe systems that allowed radar operators to distinguish friendly aircraft from enemy. Japanese night fighters had no such system. Gecko pilots sometimes attacked their own bombers in the confusion of night combat. American bombers carried electronic countermeasures. Devices that jammed Japanese radar, created false targets, confused ground controllers. Japanese aircraft had no ECM capability. No way to counter American radar except to avoid it. The result was predictable. By mid-1945, Japanese night fighter effectiveness had collapsed. Not because pilots stopped trying. Lieutenant Endo flew until August 19, 1945. 4 days after Japan announced its surrender. He was intercepting B-32s conducting photo reconnaissance when gunners shot him down. He survived, one of the few elite night fighter pilots who lived to see peace. But survival was not victory. The night fighter force that had once protected Japan's empire had been reduced to symbolic resistance. Flying outdated aircraft with obsolete radar against an enemy that owned the sky in daylight and darkness alike. The psychology of this failure was devastating. Japanese pilots had been taught that spirit and skill would triumph over material advantage. That Bushido, the way of the warrior, made them superior to American adversaries who relied on technology and mass production. The night fighter campaign shattered this belief. When a Gecko pilot climbed into darkness to intercept a bomber stream he could not find, when his radar showed only static while American formations cruised overhead dropping incendiaries, when he returned to base having fired no shots and watched his city burn, what remained of that belief? Reports from Japanese night fighter units in early 1945 describe exhaustion and despair. Pilots flew multiple sorties per night. Landed. Refueled. Launched again while the previous rate's fires still burned. Success rates dropped from occasional kills to none. Mechanical failures increased. Crashes multiplied. One pilot's diary, recovered after the war, contains an entry from May 1945. We are ghosts flying among ghosts. The Americans do not fear us. They do not even see us. We climb toward them and they pass overhead as if we do not exist. What is the purpose of courage when the enemy cannot be touched? This was the reality that Lieutenant Sachio Endo faced on every mission. Not a question of bravery. Not a question of skill. But a question of physics and electronics. Could a fighter detect a target it could not see? Could it catch a bomber that flew faster? Could it survive a defense that grew stronger while its own forces withered? The answer, written in the burning ruins of 6 to 7 Japanese cities, was no. Japan's elite night fighters, for all their innovation and sacrifice, could not overcome the technological chasm that separated their radar from America's. They had fought with everything they possessed. And it had not been enough. But the consequences extended deeper than kill ratios and burning cities. They reached into the psychology of an empire. They shattered the fundamental assumptions upon which Japan's military doctrine had been built. And they revealed a truth that Japanese leadership refused to accept until it was far too late. The radar war was not simply a contest of technology. It was a contest of industrial systems, of educational infrastructure, of scientific philosophy. And in that contest, Japan had been outmatched before the first bomb fell. In the depths of the Hamamatsu research facility, Japanese engineers worked desperately to close the gap. The Mark III Type 6 radar, installed in late-model Geckos, represented their best effort. 3 kilometers maximum detection range. But American bombers approached in formations spread across 50 kilometers of sky. Even if a Gecko's radar detected one target, dozens more slipped through undetected. Japanese industry could not mass-produce the cavity magnetrons necessary for centimetric radar. The devices that allowed British and American systems to operate on shorter wavelengths, achieving greater precision and resistance to jamming. Japan captured examples from downed Allied aircraft, reverse-engineered them, but by the time Japanese versions entered production, they were already obsolete. The educational gap compounded the technological deficit. American radar operators trained for months. They learned to distinguish aircraft from ground clutter, to track multiple targets simultaneously, to vector fighters onto intercepts with precision. Japanese radar operators received weeks of training at most, often less. They operated equipment that was temperamental, unreliable, prone to interference, and the doctrine itself was flawed. Japanese military leadership viewed radar as an aid to visual interception, a tool to bring the pilot close enough to see his target. American doctrine treated radar as the primary sensor. Visual contact was confirmation, not requirement. This fundamental difference in philosophy meant that even when Japanese technology approached parity, its employment lagged years behind. Lieutenant Sachio Endo understood this better than most. On the night of May 25 to 26, 1945, he and his wingman Shiro Kuratori achieved what should have been impossible. Flying from Yokosuka, they intercepted a B-29 formation attacking Tokyo. In the chaos of searchlights and anti-aircraft fire, they found 5 targets. 5 kills in one night, a feat that would make any pilot an ace. But Endo knew it was luck. The bombers had flown through a concentration of searchlight beams. The geckos had positioned perfectly. The radar, for once, had functioned without failure. Every variable had aligned. And even then, hundreds of other B-29s had completed their mission unopposed. The American losses that night, 14 bombers from a force of 464, were considered acceptable. Sustainable. The mathematics of attrition favored the side with 3,900 B-29s in production against an enemy with fewer than 500 night fighters total. And those 500 were scattered across the empire, defending not just Japan but occupied China, Korea, Manchuria, Southeast Asia. There were never enough. There would never be enough. By June 1945, Japanese air defense strategy had effectively collapsed. Fuel shortages grounded most fighters. Those that flew did so without coordination. Ground radar stations transmitted conflicting vectors. Communication between units had deteriorated to the point where friendly fire incidents became routine. Japanese night fighters sometimes attacked their own bombers returning from missions. The Americans, by contrast, had refined their system to terrifying efficiency. B-29s flew individual approaches to targets, arriving from different directions, at staggered altitudes, across hours-long bombing windows. This made interception nearly impossible. A night fighter could position for one bomber only to have a dozen others pass overhead or below while he climbed or dove. P-61 Black Widows, now operating from Iwo Jima and later from Okinawa, hunted the hunters. Their radar could detect geckos at ranges where Japanese systems saw nothing. American night fighters would stalk Japanese interceptors, following them as they searched for B-29s, then destroy them before the Japanese pilots even knew they were being tracked. On the night of August 14, 1945, hours before Japan announced its surrender, Lieutenant Sachio Endo flew his final mission. P-61 fighters were reported over Tokyo. Endo climbed to intercept. At 18,000 feet, his radar operator called a contact. Endo turned toward it. Gunfire erupted from below. A Black Widow had detected Endo's gecko, positioned beneath it, and fired upward using its own oblique cannons. The irony was not lost on the few who understood what had happened. The weapon that Japan had pioneered, the upward-firing cannon that had made the gecko effective, had been adopted and perfected by the Americans. Used against its creators, Endo's gecko disintegrated. He and his radar operator ejected, parachuted into Tokyo Bay. Both survived. 4 days later, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. The night fighter war was over. But the lessons remained. And they were harsh. In the immediate aftermath, As occupation forces surveyed the wreckage of Japan's air defense system, American analysts compiled reports. They documented the primitive state of Japanese radar, the shortage of trained operators, the lack of coordination between services, the absence of electronic countermeasures, the failure to develop effective tactics against low-altitude night attacks. One report, still partially classified, contained a stark assessment. Japanese night fighter crews displayed exceptional courage and skill. But courage and skill, unsupported by adequate technology and industrial capacity, could not overcome American material and electronic superiority. The decisive factor in the air war was not the quality of individual pilots but the systematic application of radar-guided interception. For Japan, the cost had been catastrophic. 8 B-29s were destroyed by night fighters during the entire firebombing campaign of March through August 1945. 8. Against losses of over 325,000 civilians killed. 6 to 7 cities burned. 40% of urban industrial capacity destroyed. The night fighters had failed not because their pilots lacked skill or determination. They had failed because the technological and industrial foundation upon which their defense depended did not exist. Japan's radar was inferior. Its production capacity inadequate. Its scientific infrastructure unable to match American innovation. If we pause here, as the script reaches its conclusion, we should reflect on what these events teach us about technological warfare and the human cost of industrial disparity. The stories of men like Seiichiro Endo deserve to be remembered not as failures but as examples of what happens when courage confronts an unbridgeable technological gap. If this deep dive into history resonates with you, please consider subscribing and sharing this story so these critical lessons aren't forgotten. The legacy of the Night Fighter War extended far beyond August 1945. It shaped how nations approached air defense for the next 7 decades. It demonstrated that radar, not the aircraft itself, had become the decisive weapon in modern aerial warfare. And it revealed a fundamental shift in military power. Industrial capacity and technological innovation now mattered more than warrior spirit. For the pilots who survived, the peace brought complicated emotions. Lieutenant Seiichiro Endo, who had destroyed 8 B-29s and damaged 8 more, returned to civilian life. He never spoke publicly about his experiences. But in private conversations recorded decades later, he offered a reflection that captured the night fighter's dilemma. "We were samurai fighting riflemen," he said. "We trained for years to perfect our skills. We flew missions where one mistake meant death. We killed when we could. But the Americans did not need skill. They had radar that saw in darkness. They had so many bombers that shooting down 10 meant nothing. They had a system. And we had only ourselves." This statement, more than any after-action report or casualty statistic, summarized the Night Fighter War. Individual excellence could not overcome systematic advantage. Japan's finest pilots, flying innovative aircraft, employing tactics that should have worked, had been rendered irrelevant by an enemy who fought with electrons and industrial mass production. The gecko, that improvised night fighter born from a rejected reconnaissance plane, had proven the concept. Upward-firing cannons could destroy bombers. Patient stalking could defeat defensive armament. Japanese pilots could kill in darkness. But proving the concept and winning the war were different things entirely. By war's end, fewer than 470 geckos had been built. Against this, America produced 3,970 B-29s, 706 P-61 Black Widows, thousands of radar sets, millions of vacuum tubes, an industrial torrent that Japan's cottage industries could never hope to match. The psychological impact on Japanese society was profound. For generations, Japanese military culture had emphasized spirit over material. The belief that superior training, discipline, and willpower could overcome mere numbers and technology. The Night Fighter campaign shattered this belief. When B-29s flew over Tokyo at 7,000 feet, dropping incendiaries while Japanese fighters circled helplessly above, unable to descend fast enough to intercept, the myth of spiritual superiority died. When American radar guided Black Widows onto targets in total darkness while Japanese pilots searched visually and found nothing, the myth of warrior excellence died. When cities burned and millions fled and the night fighters could do nothing to stop it, the myth of invincibility died. These were not deaths by combat. They were deaths by obsolescence. And for a culture that prized honor and martial skill, obsolescence was more painful than any battlefield defeat. In the decades after the war, Japanese technology surged. The nation that had lagged in radar development became a leader in electronics. The country that could not mass-produce cavity magnetrons became a manufacturing powerhouse. But this transformation was built on the ashes of humiliation. On the understanding that modern warfare demanded not just courage but industrial and technological supremacy. The night fighters taught this lesson in blood and burning cities. They proved that in the 20th century, war would be won not by the best pilots but by the best systems. Not by individual heroism but by integrated technology. Not by the samurai but by the engineer. And yet, we must remember the men themselves. Seiichiro Endo, Shigetoshi Kudo, Yasuna Kozono, Juzo Kuramoto, Shiro Kuratori. These were not failures. They were professionals who fought with everything they possessed against an enemy they could neither see nor catch nor defeat. When Endo ejected from his burning gecko on August 19, 1945, he had flown 73 night combat missions. He had launched into darkness knowing that his radar might fail, that his prey might be too fast, that American fighters might be stalking him with systems he could not detect. And he had flown anyway. Because it was his duty. Because his city was burning. Because even futile resistance was better than none. This was not the story of cowards. It was the story of men who understood they were losing and fought regardless. Who flew outdated aircraft against impossible odds. Who watched their cities die beneath them and kept flying. Who knew the war was lost and still climbed into the darkness one more time. The Night Fighter War ended not with a climactic battle but with a whimper. On August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered. The B-29 raids stopped. The night fighters were grounded. And in the silence that followed, survivors confronted the magnitude of what had been lost. Not just cities. Not just lives. But the belief that had sustained them. The conviction that Japanese spirit could overcome American material. That skill and courage mattered more than technology and industry. That the way of the warrior could still prevail in the age of radar and strategic bombing. The night fighters had fought for this belief. And they had watched it die. City by city. Raid by raid. Night after night of climbing toward targets they could not find and enemies they could not catch. In the end, the question was not why Japan's elite night fighters could not stop America's radar-guided death. The question was what it meant that they tried. That they kept trying. That even when the mathematics of defeat were undeniable, they launched into darkness one more time. Perhaps this is the real legacy. Not the kill ratios or the burning cities or the technological disparity, but the human capacity to fight for lost causes. To resist even when resistance is futile. To climb into darkness knowing that darkness will win. The Gecko Night Fighters represent a moment when the old world of martial skill collided with the new world of electronic warfare. When samurai met radar and discovered that honor could not defeat electrons. When the ancient belief in spirit over material was tested against American industrial might and found wanting. They were the last warriors of a dying age. Flying machines that should not have been fighters. Hunting enemies they could not see. Defending a homeland that technology had rendered defenseless. And when the war ended, when the last Gecko landed and the last pilot climbed from his cockpit, an era ended with them. The age when individual excellence could shape battles. When skill and courage were enough. When the warrior mattered more than the system. The night fighters proved that this age was over. That modern war belonged to nations with superior technology, industrial capacity, and scientific infrastructure. That radar mattered more than reflexes. That mass production mattered more than training. That electrons would defeat courage every time. This was their legacy. Not failure. Not cowardice. But obsolescence. They were magnificent pilots fighting a war that no longer rewarded magnificence. They were samurai in an age that had moved beyond samurai. They were the last to believe that spirit could overcome material. And they were wrong. But they were wrong magnificently. Wrong courageously. Wrong in a way that demands our respect even as we recognize the futility of their struggle. Because they fought anyway. Because they launched into darkness when darkness meant death. Because even doomed resistance has meaning. Lieutenant Sachio Endo died in 2003. In his final years, he spoke occasionally about the night fighter war. About the B-29s that he could hear but not catch. About the radar that promised so much and delivered so little. About the nights when Tokyo burned and he circled helplessly above, searching for targets that his equipment could not find. We knew we could not win, he said in his last recorded interview. But we flew anyway. Because our people were dying below us. Because surrender was not yet ordered. Because a night fighter's duty is to hunt, even when hunting is hopeless. This, perhaps, is why Japan's elite night fighters could not stop America's radar-guided death. Not because they lacked courage or skill or determination, but because the war they were fighting was not the war that courage, skill, and determination could win. It was a war of systems, of technology, of industrial capacity. And in that war, the samurai had already lost before they ever took to the sky. The scream of B-29 engines faded into history. The fires that consumed Japanese cities cooled to ash. The night fighters were scrapped or put in museums. And the lesson remained. That modern war rewards not warriors but engineers. Not courage but capacity. Not spirit but systems. This was the bitter truth that Japan's night fighters died to prove. And in their deaths, they marked the end of an age and the beginning of our own. An age where technology determines victory. Where industrial might shapes history. Where even the bravest pilots cannot overcome the radar they cannot see and the enemy they cannot catch. The story of Japan's elite night fighters is not a story of failure. It is a story of transformation. Of a world where samurai with upward-firing cannons hunted superfortresses in darkness. And discovered that darkness itself had become their enemy. That the night belonged not to those who could see but to those who could detect. Not to the skilled but to the systematic. Not to the warriors but to the engineers. And when the last gecko landed for the final time, when the last night fighter walked away from his aircraft knowing he would never fly it again, the age of the warrior ended. And the age of the system began. This is their legacy. This is their lesson. This is why Japan's elite night fighters could not stop America's radar-guided death. Because the war they fought required weapons they did not possess. And the courage to fly without those weapons, though magnificent, was not enough.